St. Petersburg, 1952. In the harsh aftermath of the siege of Leningrad, one of history's most devastating military blockades, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin entered a world defined by scarcity, survival, and Soviet control. The Putin family lived in a communal apartment, sharing a kitchen and bathroom with multiple families. The hallways reeked of cabbage and uncertainty. Young Vladimir would often chase rats in the stairwell with sticks alongside neighborhood children, early training in persistence and hunting down targets. Where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments below, let's know where you are watching from. His father, a submariner and factory worker, carried the physical and psychological wounds of war. His mother, who had nearly starved to death during the siege, possessed a fierce protective instinct for her only surviving child. Two brothers lost before him, one to diphtheria, one to the brutality of the siege. Vladimir grew up with the invisible presence of ghosts, the weight of survival guilt that would later manifest as a determination to never be vulnerable. "I was a hooligan, not a pioneer," Putin would later admit about his childhood. Scrappy, small for his age, he was the boy who would attack first if he sensed aggression coming, who would rather strike fear than receive it. The communal apartment building had no hot water, no bathtub, and stood 5 stories high without an elevator. The Putins occupied a single room on the 5th floor. When carrying water upstairs, young Vladimir encountered rats in the entryway. Once, cornered by a particularly large rat, instead of retreating, he chased it down with a stick until it had nowhere to go. There, on that stairwell, he would later recall, "I learned a lesson I've never forgotten. If you want to survive, you must make them fear you." This environment, where strength was currency and weakness invited predation, formed the psychological foundation of the future leader. While Western leaders would later misread him through their lens of democratic values and rational self-interest, they failed to understand that Putin's core formative experiences taught him something very different: power isn't shared, it's seized and jealously guarded. Power, its acquisition, maintenance, and expansion, forms the central thread of Putin's existence. But not power as a means to an end, power as the end itself. Unlike leaders who view power as a tool to implement ideological visions, Putin embodies a more primal understanding: in a world of predators and prey, only absolute control ensures survival. This isn't mere authoritarianism, it's existential. The trauma of Soviet collapse, which Putin called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, wasn't about lost communist ideology. It was about witnessing a once mighty empire reduced to begging for international aid, its nuclear arsenal suddenly vulnerable, its citizens selling personal possessions on the street for food. For a KGB officer trained to defend Soviet might, this humiliation burned deep. It wasn't just a nation that collapsed, it was the entire structure that gave meaning to his professional existence. The lesson he extracted wasn't about democracy's triumph but about power's fragility when not ruthlessly maintained. This perspective explains why Western assumptions about Putin have consistently failed. They expect him to operate by cost-benefit analyses that prioritize economic prosperity or international standing. Instead, he calculates in a different currency altogether: the currency of absolute control, where compromise equals weakness, and weakness invites destruction. As we follow his rise, remember this lens through which he views every decision: not, "Will this make Russia prosperous?" but, "Will this make my position unassailable?" The official biography claims Putin chose the path of intelligence work after being inspired by Soviet spy films. The truth, as always with Putin, lies deeper. At Leningrad State University in the 1970s, studying law, Putin was already marked by KGB talent spotters who recognized in him valuable qualities: physical resilience despite his small stature, psychological adaptability, and most importantly, an ability to read and manipulate others, skills honed in the rough yards of his childhood. His KGB application, made without telling even his parents, revealed something crucial about the young Putin: a preference for shadows over spotlight, for influence over recognition. The KGB wasn't merely a career choice, it was entrance into Russia's most elite brotherhood, a parallel structure of power that operated by different rules than ordinary Soviet society. For a boy from a communal apartment with no connections, it represented not just advancement but transformation. His posting to Dresden in the 1980s, often dismissed as unimportant in his development, was actually formative. Far from the glamorous foreign intelligence work in Western capitals, Dresden was about maintaining Soviet control in a satellite state. Putin learned the mechanisms of surveillance, recruitment of assets, and most critically, how systems of power can be maintained through perfectly calibrated fear. Then came the night that would burn into his consciousness forever. As the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, angry protesters approached the KGB building in Dresden. Putin, alone with sensitive documents and minimal security, called Moscow for instructions. "Moscow is silent," came the response. In that moment of abandonment, watching the crowds through the window, preparing to burn documents as the mob approached, Putin experienced what he would later call a personal apocalypse, the evaporation of superpower authority in real time. When he later said, "The weak get beaten," he wasn't offering a philosophical position. He was recounting a traumatic memory, one that would guide every future decision. 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. For ordinary Russians, it meant bread lines and uncertainty. For the security apparatus Putin belonged to, it meant something far worse: irrelevance. The new Russia embraced Western consultants, economists, and their shock therapy. The KGB, renamed the FSB, found itself sidelined, its officers selling their skills to the highest bidder or driving taxis to survive. This is where Putin's true genius revealed itself. While others lamented the past, he recognized the opportunity in chaos. Returning to his native St. Petersburg, he secured a position as deputy to Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, his former law professor. On paper, he handled international relations for the city. In reality, he became the gatekeeper. Every foreign business wanting to operate in Russia's second-largest city needed Putin's approval. In a country transforming to capitalism without established rules, this position was gold. A German business executive from that period later revealed, "We understood that without Putin's signature, nothing moved. And to get that signature, there were always conditions." The conflict that defined this period wasn't just between democracy and authoritarianism, as Western observers framed it. It was between different visions of power in post-Soviet Russia. The oligarchs believed money was the ultimate power. The politicians believed formal office conferred power. Putin alone understood that real power lay in controlling the invisible networks of security services, organized crime, and resource distribution. While flashy businessmen built mansions and bought football clubs, Putin built something far more valuable: a network of loyal security officers placed in key positions across government and industry. The so-called Siloviki, men of force, became his shadow infrastructure. Most critically, he recognized something about Yeltsin's Russia that others missed: beneath the democratic rhetoric lay a profound public humiliation. Russians didn't want just economic recovery, they wanted restoration of dignity. This psychological insight would become his path to the presidency. To understand Putin's rise, we must understand the characters who enabled it, and whom he subsequently controlled with methodical precision. Boris Berezovsky, oligarch, mathematician, kingmaker. In the chaos of 1999, it was Berezovsky who first championed Putin as Yeltsin's successor, believing the unassuming FSB director would be controllable, a puppet protecting oligarch interests. "I thought he was perfect, not too bright, no personal ambition," Berezovsky later confessed from exile shortly before his controversial suicide. "My greatest miscalculation." Igor Sechin, Putin's most trusted lieutenant since St. Petersburg days. Never seeking the spotlight, Sechin embodies the shadow power that Putin values. As head of Rosneft, Russia's oil giant, he controls the arteries of Russia's economic lifeblood. A former colleague once described Sechin: "He enters a room, and the temperature seems to drop 5 degrees. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't need to. His very presence communicates that he knows things about you." Gennady Timchenko, Roman Abramovich, Arkady and Boris Rodenberg, childhood friends, judo partners, and billionaires whose fortunes rose with Putin's power. These aren't merely associates, they're the holders of Putin's personal fortune, estimated by some at over $200 billion, disguised through a labyrinth of companies and assets. The relationship isn't friendship in the Western sense, but something more primal, mutual hostages to shared secrets. Each knows that their fate is tied to Putin's continued rule. The outer circle includes the disposed of Alexander Litvinenko, poisoned with polonium in London. Boris Nemtsov, shot within sight of the Kremlin. Anna Politkovskaya, investigative journalist killed on Putin's birthday. The pattern reveals Putin's management style: absolute loyalty rewarded lavishly, disloyalty punished spectacularly. The public nature of these punishments isn't accidental, they're messages. Not just to enemies, but to friends. As one former Kremlin insider put it, Putin doesn't need to threaten his inner circle. They've seen what happens to those who leave it. September 1999. Russians wake to unthinkable horror. A series of apartment bombings across the country kill over 300 innocent citizens sleeping in their beds. The official explanation came swiftly: Chechen terrorists. The bombings provided the perfect justification for the Second Chechen War, and for an unknown prime minister named Vladimir Putin to demonstrate decisive leadership. "We will hunt them down. We will kill them even in their toilets," Putin famously declared, his approval rating soaring from 2% to over 45% in weeks. But then came Ryazan, the bombing that didn't happen. On September 22, residents of an apartment building caught FSB agents planting what appeared to be explosives in their basement. Initially declared a training exercise, after discovery, the incident raised questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Journalist David Satter, later banned from Russia, wrote, "The evidence is overwhelming that the bombings were carried out by the FSB. They had the means, motive, and opportunity." Former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko publicly accused Putin of orchestrating the bombings. In 2006, he died an agonizing death from polonium poisoning in London. The parliamentary commission established to investigate the bombings was dissolved without issuing findings. Its chairman, independent deputy Sergei Kovalev, later said, "The truth about these events would undermine the legitimacy of Putin's power." Several others investigating the bombings met untimely deaths. Yuri Shchekochikhin, mysterious poisoning. Otto Lacies, beaten to death. Mikhail Trepashkin, arrested days before presenting evidence. Consider the psychology at work. If these allegations hold any truth, Putin's first significant act as a national leader wasn't just ruthless, it represented a willingness to sacrifice Russian lives for power acquisition. It established a pattern: create the crisis to which only you are the solution. This isn't merely a historical detail, it's the foundation stone of Putin's Russia. The social contract offered to citizens was clear: surrender certain freedoms, and I will protect you from terrors that I might control. Let me take you inside the walls of power, to moments that defined Putin's consolidation of authority, conversations reconstructed from multiple insider accounts. October 2003. The richest man in Russia, oil magnate Mikhail Khodorkovsky, has been funding opposition parties and questioning corruption in Putin's inner circle. His plane lands at a Siberian airport for refueling. FSB officer: target has landed. Awaiting your order. Putin: proceed. Armed agents storm the plane, arresting Khodorkovsky on tax evasion charges. He will spend the next decade in prison. His oil company Yukos, worth over $40 billion, will be dismantled and absorbed primarily by state-controlled Rosneft. Later that evening, Putin addresses his advisors. Putin: let this be absolutely clear. The era of oligarchs dictating to the Kremlin is over. Russia is not a joint stock company. May 2000. Putin's first meeting with Russian television executives after becoming president. Putin: gentlemen, I want you to understand your position clearly. You may be millionaires, you may have billions, but while I am president, you will be beggars. Your prosperity exists solely at my discretion. When media oligarch Vladimir Guzinski challenged this assertion, his NTV television network was seized within months. He fled into exile. 2008, the Russian constitution limited Putin to 2 consecutive terms. His solution was elegant: install loyal subordinate Dmitry Medvedev as president while becoming prime minister himself. At a private United Russia Party meeting, an associate allegedly asked about the arrangement. Party official: Vladimir Vladimirovich, will you be controlling things from behind the scenes? Putin: there will be no behind the scenes. True to his word, in 2012, Putin returned to the presidency through carefully managed elections, later changing the constitution to potentially remain in power until 2036. These aren't just anecdotes, they're glimpses into a leadership philosophy built on clear dominance signals. Where Western leaders typically couch power in diplomatic language, Putin's explicit articulation of power relationships reflects his understanding that ambiguity creates weakness, and weakness invites challenge. To understand Putin's hold on Russia, we must understand the emotional landscape he navigates, both his own and that of the Russian populace. The most striking aspect of Putin's public persona is its emotional flatness. The micro-expressions that betray most leaders' feelings are notably absent. This isn't merely personality, it's strategy. Emotional opacity creates an effect psychologists call the blank screen projection, where observers project their own desires onto the expressionless figure. For Russians emerging from the chaos and humiliation of the 1990s, Putin's stoicism represented stability itself. His controlled anger channeled their rage at Russia's diminished status. His calm confidence promised restoration of greatness. The carefully staged images, Putin finding ancient artifacts while diving, shooting tigers with tranquilizer darts, flying with migrating birds, speak to a deep understanding of Russian emotional needs. They aren't merely propaganda, they're psychological fulfillment of a nation's desire for a strong, almost mystical father figure connecting Russia to its imperial and natural greatness. The emotional contract Putin offers Russians is subtle but powerful: I will bear the burden of ruthlessness needed to restore our greatness, so you don't have to confront moral complexities. For a population traumatized by Soviet collapse, this absolution from moral responsibility is powerfully attractive. It explains why even Russians who recognize corruption and repression often respond with a shrug rather than outrage. Putin's own emotional landscape remains more obscure. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, once bitten by Putin's dog despite her known fear of dogs, observed, "I'm not sure Vladimir Putin is capable of empathy as Westerners understand it. He perceives it as weakness." This isn't psychopathy in the clinical sense. Rather, it's the emotional adaptation of someone who learned early that vulnerability equals danger. The boy who had to fight in Leningrad courtyards became the man who sees compromise as capitulation. Perhaps most telling is what makes Putin genuinely angry, not criticism of policies, but mockery of his masculinity or physical prowess. The topless horseback photos and judo demonstrations aren't vanity, they're visual assertions of the personal strength he believes underlies political power. Understanding this emotional architecture helps explain why Western sanctions and pressure often backfire. They feed the narrative of besiegement that justifies ever tighter control. 2004, Beslan school siege. Over 1,100 people, including 777 children, taken hostage by Chechen militants. The crisis ends with 334 dead, including 186 children. Within days, Putin announces sweeping changes, abolishing direct regional governor elections, tightening media controls, expanding security service powers. Former Prime Minister Mikhail Kazyanov later revealed, in the cabinet meeting after Beslan, it was clear these reforms had been prepared long before the tragedy. They were simply waiting for the right moment to implement them. The pattern repeated with the Nordost Theater crisis in Moscow, a hostage situation ending with 170 deaths, followed by media restrictions preventing investigation into the government's handling of the rescue. 2008, the global financial crisis strikes Russia hard. Oil prices collapse. The ruble devalues. Economic insecurity threatens Putin's implicit promise of prosperity in exchange for political docility. The solution? External enemies. Russian tanks roll into Georgia. State media pivots from economic coverage to patriotic war reporting. Approval ratings that had begun to slip suddenly surge back. 2011, the Arab Spring inspires protest movements worldwide. In Moscow, thousands demonstrate against electoral fraud and Putin's planned return to the presidency. The regime's response reveals Putin's playbook for crisis management. 1. Initial restraint to identify leaders. 2. Targeted arrests of key organizers. 3. New legislation criminalizing protest activities. 4. Creation of pro-government counter-movements. 5. Media saturation portraying protesters as foreign agents. By 2014, with domestic discontent simmering and sanctions beginning after Crimea's annexation, Putin needed something more dramatic. The Ukraine crisis wasn't just opportunism, explained a former Kremlin advisor who has since fled Russia. It was a controlled explosion to redirect domestic anxiety outward and re-establish Putin as the defender of Russian interests against Western encroachment. Each crisis, whether genuine or manufactured, followed the same pattern: initial destabilization, followed by Putin's personal intervention as the sole source of resolution. The message was consistent: without me, chaos returns. This strategy transformed potential threats to Putin's power into opportunities for its expansion, a political judo that uses the momentum of crisis against opponents. Every leader faces a critical decision point: use power as a means to achieve policy goals, or make the accumulation of power itself the primary objective. For Putin, this moment came in 2011 to 2012, as protests challenged his planned return to the presidency. Insiders report that Putin was genuinely shocked by the protests. He had believed his economic record had earned Russians' acquiescence, if not affection. The demonstrations revealed something disturbing: prosperity alone wouldn't guarantee his position. Former Kremlin speechwriter Abbas Galyamov later revealed, after those protests, Putin changed. He became obsessed with control in ways we hadn't seen before. The system shifted from authoritarian to truly totalitarian in its aspirations. The response came in stages. The Foreign Agent Law, requiring NGOs receiving foreign funding to register as foreign agents. Restrictions on internet content and platform ownership. The merger of news agencies under state control. Increased funding for domestic security forces. A pivot to aggressive nationalism as state ideology. Most tellingly, after 2012, Putin rarely appeared in settings he couldn't completely control. The annual, direct-line, television events where citizens could ask questions were increasingly scripted. His physical security detail doubled in size. A psychological shift had occurred, from confident leader balancing competing interests to isolated sovereign seeing threats everywhere. The turning point wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. In 2020, constitutional amendments not only reset Putin's term limits but included revealing additions: immunity from prosecution for former presidents, increased presidential powers over the judiciary, and explicit references to Russia's thousand-year history and traditional values. These weren't just technical changes, they were the codification of Putin's psychological transformation, from a leader operating within a system to a leader who had become the system itself. As Russian political scientist Ekaterina Shulman observed, the amendments essentially transformed Russia from a state with a president to a president with a state. This turning point must be understood to grasp what followed: increasingly aggressive foreign policy, intensified domestic repression, and a leadership style defined not by institutional constraints but by personal whim, the hallmarks of absolute power. Beyond political structures and economic control lies Putin's most profound achievement: the transformation of Russia's national psychology to mirror his own worldview. When Putin came to power, Russia was a society tentatively embracing Western liberal values, however chaotically. Today's Russia reflects Putin's core beliefs: strength over law, cynicism over idealism, loyalty over competence. This transformation is evident across institutions. Education now emphasizes patriotic values over critical thinking. History textbooks have been rewritten to downplay Soviet repression and emphasize Russian victimhood at foreign hands. Military education starts in elementary school. Media evolved from chaotic plurality to sophisticated manipulation. Rather than simple censorship, Putin's system floods the information space with conflicting narratives until citizens conclude truth itself is unknowable, except what comes from the strong leader. Peter Pomerantsev, who worked in Russian television, explained, "The goal isn't to make people believe a specific lie, but to make them believe nothing at all." In that vacuum of certainty, Putin's authority becomes the only constant. Religion, once persecuted under communism, has been reintegrated as a pillar of state power. The Russian Orthodox Church provides moral authority to Putin's conservative nationalism, while receiving privileged status and property in return. Even physical space has been transformed. Soviet memorials once removed have been restored. New monuments celebrate imperial Russian figures. Architecture increasingly references pre-revolutionary styles, a visual rejection of both Soviet and Western modernism. Most profound is the transformation of ordinary Russians' expectations of citizenship itself. The social contract has shifted from aspiration toward rights and freedoms to acceptance of constraints in exchange for restored pride. A 2019 survey revealed something startling. When asked what made them proud to be Russian, respondents placed Putin himself ahead of cultural achievements, scientific accomplishments, or even victory in World War II. This is the ultimate transformation, from a leader who serves the state to a leader who embodies it. The Russian phrase for this phenomenon is revealing. They speak not of Putin's Russia, but of Putin's state, Государство Путина, implying ownership rather than stewardship. As Russian philosopher Mikhail Epstein observed, Putin didn't just change Russia's government, he changed what Russians believe government is for. As our journey through Putin's rise concludes, we must confront the ultimate question: what is the cost of one man's absolute power, for Russia, for the world, and for Putin himself? For ordinary Russians, the price is measured in foregone possibilities. Today's Russia has stability but lacks dynamism. Its economy remains dependent on natural resources rather than innovation. Its brightest minds often seek opportunities abroad. A Russian economist who requested anonymity put it starkly: "We've built a 19th-century empire with 21st-century propaganda tools and nuclear weapons. But we haven't built a country where our children want to build their futures." For the world, Putin's model of governance presents a template for aspiring autocrats everywhere, a masterclass in how democratic institutions can be hollowed out while maintaining their facade, how information spaces can be polluted until truth loses meaning, how grievance and nostalgia can be weaponized against progress. But perhaps the highest price is paid by Putin himself. The system he created to ensure his security has become his prison. The man who once moved freely through European capitals now rarely leaves heavily secured compounds. Once able to engage world leaders as equals, he now sits at the end of absurdly long tables, physically and metaphorically distanced. History teaches us that systems of absolute power eventually become unsustainable, not despite their control but because of it. They lose the ability to adapt, to incorporate new information, to correct course when needed. The untold story of Vladimir Putin's rise reveals something universal about power itself. Its pursuit can become a substitute for purpose, its maintenance can become an end rather than a means, its accumulation can isolate the very person who wields it. There's a Russian proverb that captures this paradox perfectly: it is easy to go into the wolf's den, but hard to come out. Vladimir Putin entered the den of power as a pragmatic survivor and emerged as something else entirely, a man who transformed a nation in his image but may have lost himself in the process. The true legacy of Putin's rise won't be measured in territories gained or enemies defeated, but in a simpler question: did his absolute power make Russia greater, or merely make Russia his? The story of Putin's rise holds crucial lessons for all of us living in democracies that we too often take for granted. What signs of eroding institutions should we watch for? How vulnerable are our own societies to the tactics of division and distraction that enabled his consolidation of power? What aspect of Putin's rise surprised you most? Did you see parallels to political developments in your own country? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive revealing, please consider subscribing for more geopolitical analysis that goes beyond headlines to examine the psychological and strategic underpinnings of world events. Where were you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments. I'm curious to see how global the interest in this untold story truly is. Remember, understanding how power works is the first step to ensuring it serves rather than subjugates. Like, subscribe, and share this video to help others recognize the patterns before they become too entrenched to change. The most dangerous aspect of absolute power isn't what it does to nations, but what it makes us believe about its inevitability.